Hello, literary themes and poetry students. Welcome for our last video lecture of the semester. Today we will be studying two poems by the great British poet Philip Larkin, the first of which we will spend most of our time on, but we will briefly address the second one as well. The first poem is entitled Church Going, which is a poem that even before we get into discussing the poem itself, we might want to discuss the title of it. Church-going could be seen as an adjective to describe people who go to church. If he is a church-going man, we would assume that means that he's a person who regularly attends religious services. And so that's obviously the first context that comes to mind, the concept of being a regular mass attendee. However, obviously once you read the poem, you become aware that that's not the context that Larkin is referring to. And the speaker in the poem is visiting a church, but he's visiting a church under different circumstances. And in fact, he lets that be known in the first lines. Once I'm sure there's nothing going on, I step inside, letting the door thud shut. He wants to make sure that there's nothing going on in the church before he goes in there, which implies, obviously, that he does not consider himself to be a member of the community of the church and does not consider himself to be an attendee. So the circumstances of this person visiting this particular church are more related to sort of a touristic visit, going in to look at the church for other reasons than religious ones. And so that could conceivably be a second way of interpreting the title, going to church as I said, a voyeur, a tourist. And of course, the third context also relates to this particular situation, because as we move through the poem, we realize that the speaker is somewhat at odds. He doesn't consider himself a religious person, and in fact he might be slightly skeptical or cynical about the church. And as we move towards the end of the poem, it becomes clear that some of the reference could conceivably be connected to the idea of church going, as in leaving, and the sense that the church, the institution of the church, and the physical building of the church also are in a state of decline. And certainly you can see that in Quebec, where you had a very strongly religious society that after the Tranquil Revolution, gradually the Catholic Church took less and less prominence and power in Quebec society. And so in cities like Quebec, you have churches all over the place, every few blocks. In my neighborhood, certainly every few blocks, you'll find a church. Now, as time goes by and the public who supports those churches diminishes as they get older, and some of them die, and they're not necessarily replaced with young, fervent worshipers, the maintenance of those buildings becomes problematic. And as I said, in my neighborhood, there's been a few that have either been torn down, there are some that have been converted into condos, where you desacralize the building, you take the sacredness away from it and you make it something else, a laic building, and then you can make apartments or whatever. There's one that's an art gallery, etc., and so forth. So there we have the sense that church going, as referred to in the title of the poem, could mean something else, the demise of the institution of the church. I've included a link with the information for today's class of a video of Larkin reading the poem. It's actually an audio with the sort of video footage of churches and some of the words of the poem. But basically, it's worthwhile. If you haven't listened to it yet, I would recommend that you go and listen to it, because Larkin is a British man. He's no longer with us, but his voice is very it's very expressive, let's say, and I think the emphasis that he gives to certain parts of the poem make it a pleasurable experience, or let's say at least a different experience than reading it by yourselves. So if you haven't gone and listened to that yet, do take a moment. I believe it's about 4 minutes long. The poem's a little bit long, and go and listen to Mr. Larkin reading the poem. Now, as I said, the context of this poem is a curious one. We clearly have a first-person persona, once again, an I operating within the poem, and we know certain things about the I. The I has a slightly jaded perspective. He's going into this church, but he's slightly cynical or skeptical. He's not sure about why he's doing it, and he's not sure what he's going to get in there. Once I'm sure there's nothing going on, I step inside, letting the door thud shut. Another church, matting, seats, and stone, and little books, sprawlings of flowers, cut for Sunday, brownish now, some brass and stuff up at the holy end, the small, neat organ, and a tense, musty, unignorable silence, brewed God knows how long. Hatless, I take off my cycle clips in awkward reverence, move forward, run my hand around the font. From where I stand, the roof looks almost new, cleaned or restored. Someone would know. I don't. Mounting the lectern, I peruse a few hectoring large-scale verses and pronounce "Here endeth" more loudly than I'd meant. The echoes snigger briefly. Back at the door, I sign the book, donate an Irish sixpence, reflect the place was not worth stopping for. Yet stop I did. In fact, I often do. I'm stopping in the middle of a stanza there because that seems to me like a kind of a logical stopping point. There's a turn going on there. So we have the situation of the speaker arriving in this church. He walks inside after verifying that there's not a service going on, that he's not going to be interrupting or participating in a religious service. And so he goes in, he's clearly all alone in the building, and he's looking around. He's just observing what it is. A couple curious things. We've talked about this a few times within the semester because in England, after the time of Henry VIII, there was the break with the Roman Catholic Church and the establishment of what became known as the Church of England or the Anglican Church. And so in England, you have a very curious situation with regards to architecture and churches. I don't know if any of you have ever traveled in England, in the United Kingdom, but there's an interesting reality about the churches. Roman Catholic churches tended to be great repositories of art. And actually, if you're an architecture fanatic, you may want to travel around in Europe to see the great Romanesque and Gothic cathedrals in Europe. In England, there are fewer of those because we're talking about the 1530s when Henry VIII made his decree and broke with the Church of Rome. And so the change was that the Catholic churches were sacked. We've seen that in a couple of the poems we've looked at so far this semester. When we looked at Shakespeare's Sonnet 73, the bare ruined boughs where late the sweet birds sang, and certainly when we talked about Tintern Abbey, we have this tradition of the sacking of the monasteries and the churches in England. And so the great old churches that predate the 1530s were destroyed. And of course, those are your most spectacular churches typically. If you go, as I said, into mainland Europe, if you go into Italy or France or Spain, the most amazing churches are typically Gothic, and those date from the 1100s, the 1200s, the 1300s. So many of those churches were destroyed, and basically Anglican churches have a very different sense about them. One of the key things with the break with the Church of Rome was that Rome and the Roman Catholic Church were seen as sort of profligate. They took too much money, they spent too much money, and they were too exuberant in their things. The priests became wealthy. The popes were the most powerful men in Europe, and much of the disdain was directed at that. The Protestant Reformation came about due to what was known as indulgences, where people had to pay to church officials in order to be given kind of a free pass so they could get to heaven even if they sinned. And so that was a context of the time, the 1500s. So in reaction to that, Protestant churches tend to be much less ornate, much less grandiose, so you don't have that elaborate context, and also there's much less of a tradition of artistic patronage. The church was the great patron of the arts in the Renaissance and in the late Middle Ages, so that's where you see the greatest art. Anglican churches tend to be unembellished and relatively, straightforward. There are beautiful churches in England, don't get me wrong, but they're just a very different style than the Catholic churches of mainland Europe. And so, as a result, the church that the speaker is entering here seems to be somewhat uninspiring, slightly maybe unembellished. It doesn't have that grandiose sense of, as I said, a great Gothic cathedral. And the way he describes it is sort of downplaying. It's very mundane. Another church, right? Another church implies this is something that he's done repeatedly. And he says, previously, yet stop I did, in fact I often do. So he's somebody who does like to stop and look at churches. But we see it, another church, matting, seats, stone, and little books. Okay, very kind of matter-of-fact description of the church. The little books are the homilies, right? The prayers for the church. So they're actually sacred books. Sprawlings of flowers, cut for Sunday, brownish now. The flowers are scattered around for the Mass. Very often there are flowers, fresh flowers, but cut flowers have that quality where they degrade and they begin to die, they dry up and they get less beautiful. So scrawlings of flowers, cut for Sunday, brownish now. Some brass and stuff up at the holy end. Okay, the brass and stuff, all of the phrasing here is very important, I think. The brass and stuff are all of those embellishments and all of the items that are used in the Mass. You have the chalice and you have all these sacred things that hold the communion and various other parts of the Mass service. And they're described here as brass and stuff up at the holy end. And the holy end is implying, obviously, the altar, the sacred part of the church, but describing it as the holy end sounds slightly disparaging or derogatory in a way. The small, neat organ and a tense, musty, unignorable silence. That's a curious phrasing. If you remember when we studied Seamus Heaney's punishment, that rhythm of adjectival usage often builds something important. And here you have this, a tense, musty, unignorable silence. So your noun here is silence, and the three adjectives that are used to modify it are tense, a tense silence, which implies that there's tension, there's some sort of anxiety. Why would the silence be tense? But there is that sense, right? When you walk into a church, you're expected to be quiet. So if you make a lot of noise, that would be seen as inappropriate behavior. You don't yell in a church. And so the tense silence. Musty is like the air in an enclosed room. Kind of has a sense of being stale, maybe moldy, musty air. And so the silence here is being described as musty. In other words, it has a smell, and it's a slightly negative smell. Again, a curious synesthetic adjectival usage. And the last one is unignorable, not possible to ignore, right? So we have a tense, musty, unignorable silence, brewed God knows how long, okay? And the silence is brewed. It's like this steeping, this process that's happened over time. And so curious way that he's constructed this. He doesn't know how long. He's obviously slightly irreverent here. Brewed God knows how long. Again, taking the Lord's name slightly in vain, which shows some of his irreverence. Hatless, I take off my cycle clips in awkward reverence. I was just mentioning his irreverence, but here he's talking about his awkward reverence. He doesn't have a hat, because normally the rule of thumb is when you enter a church, you're supposed to remove your hat in recognition of what's above you. You take off your hat. He doesn't have a hat, and so he takes off his cycle clips in awkward reverence. So that means the cycle clips are probably the things on his shoes that clip into a bicycle, right? So if you're riding a serious bike rider, you often have shoes and an attachment that clips your foot onto the pedal, so that when you're pedaling, when you pull, both when you push down and when you pull up, you're using your force to draw the pedal, and so you actually maximize your energy usage. And so on a serious bike trip, you might use cycle clips. And so he's obviously a biker, so he's taking a bicycle tour of the countryside, and in light of the fact that he's not wearing a hat, he decides to take off his cycle clips, because probably they make a clop clop sound when you walk on a stone floor. They're going to make an awkward sound. So he takes them off in awkward reverence. In other words, he's uncomfortable. There's an awkwardness. It's not easy. Going back to that tense silence and this awkward reverence. So both of those phrasings give us a strong sense that this person is aware of the rules of behavior, the expected behavior that you're supposed to have inside the church. But he's slightly at odds with it. It's uncomfortable, right? Unignorable, awkward. So that reverence doesn't come naturally to him. It's forced. But he knows that it's supposed to be there. I take off my cycle clips in awkward reverence, move forward, run my hand around the font. The font is typically the water, can be either baptismal or the holy water font, right? It's where you bless yourself. You have sacred water that you touch to your head. You make the sign of the cross. And so he runs his hand around the font. He's sort of touching, feeling things. From where I stand, the roof looks almost new, cleaned or restored. Someone would know. I don't. So he's looking at the roof and he's making sort of practical observations about it. It seems like the roof is new. In other words, that it's been repaired or replaced. Cleaned or restored, someone would know. I don't. Mounting the lectern. The lectern is where you have typically the holy books that are held that someone who makes the reading to the congregation will speak from. And so he's going up now to the holy end of the church, the place where the priest and the people associated with the Mass service participate. And generally you have that division. You have the laity, the people in the audience, and you have the clergy, the people who are up there conducting the service. So he's kind of breached a certain rule of decorum, because he's going up to the part where actually you're not supposed to go. Mounting the lectern, I peruse a few hectoring large-scale verses and pronounce "Here endeth" much more loudly than I'd meant. Here endeth is the expression that ends the Anglican Church service. So it's kind of calling the Mass to an end. Interestingly, probably as a child or as a young person with a little bit of an attitude with respect to the church, that might be part of the service that might be the most important. Here endeth means that Mass is over and you get to leave and go home. So he announces this up there in a louder voice than he had meant. Right? He talks about the book. I peruse a few hectoring large-scale verses. To hector is to bother someone, right? To hector is kind of like you cause them some level of discomfort. So the hectoring verses are verses that are in some way confrontational, mocking. The echoes snigger briefly. Back at the door, I sign the book, donate an Irish sixpence, reflect that the place was not worth stopping for. So you have a book, a visitor's book, that you can sign your name to say who was there, people coming from wherever. Donates an Irish sixpence. Curiously, he's in the UK. This is in the 1950s, I believe, this poem. And so the idea of an Irish sixpence, number one, it's not valid currency in the UK. It's something that doesn't really have value. And it certainly has less value than an English sixpence. So there's a sense of giving something. He's donating something, but it's kind of almost a symbolic donation. in the sense that it's not really worth that much. And of course, he's making that comment in the light of when he's talking about value, right? He says he's donating an Irish sixpence and reflect that the place was not worth stopping for. So in other words, the effort that he put into it is not worth what he got out of it. He's on his cycling tour. He walks in and he spends however much time it is. This investment, the investment that he's made is an investment of an Irish sixpence, an investment of time. And he determines that in fact the investment that he made was not a good one. I reflect that the place was not worth stopping for. Yet stop I did. In fact, I often do, and always end up much at a loss like this. Okay, so he's kind of expressing the fact that he frequently does this, and he frequently resents or is kind of, he uses the expression at a loss. In other words, he doesn't quite understand what's motivating him, why he's behaving the way he does. So he stops, he looks around, and he feels somewhat dejected, or he doesn't feel fully rewarded for the effort that he made. Yet stop I did, in fact I often do, and always end up much at a loss like this, wondering what to look for, wondering too when churches fall completely out of use, what shall we turn them into, if we shall keep a few cathedrals chronically on show, their parchment, plate, and pyx in locked cases, and let the rest rent free to rain and sheep, shall we avoid them as unlucky places? It's an interesting phrase, an interesting stanza. One of the things about this, the whole poem has had this sense, the language usage, once again, if we go back to those comments that we saw with the Romantics, with Wordsworth and Coleridge and their preface of lyrical ballads, talking about the common language of the common man, you really have the feeling that this is less about overtly poetic with capital P type of usage, and more conversational. The flow of what he's saying and the rhythm of how he speaks is very calming, very disarming. It doesn't make us have to consider too much what he's saying. And so what he is saying is talking about the lifespan of the church. Now here he's making a connection between the physical building where he finds himself, this particular little country church. He's obviously out in the countryside somewhere. This little, unimportant church, connecting it to the idea of church. When we talk about church, capital C, we're often talking about the institution, whether it's the Anglican Church or the Methodist Church or the Roman Catholic Church. You're talking about an institution that represents a set of values and a set of ideas. They're the ones who own the building, but the building is just a sort of a showcase. But the building is a very special place. A church is a special building. It's not like other buildings. As I mentioned in the beginning of the lecture, when you want to desacralize a church, if you decide this church is no longer usable or useful as a church, you can desacralize it, and you can go and say this is no longer a sacred space, and we're going to use it for something else, something practical, an art gallery or a condo complex. And so here he's talking about almost the demise of the institution of the church, wondering what to look for. He's looking around and he's kind of a little bit at a loss. Again, churches, there's a whole vocabulary, the architectural and artistic vocabulary associated with them. If you're an avid church tourist, which I happen to be, I really love Romanesque architecture from around the 9th and 10th and 11th centuries in Europe. So if you go to, Saint-Sernin in Toulouse in France, or, some of the great Romanesque churches in Castilian Spain, they're very, very beautiful, but they're this brooding, intense architecture, and you have all this language of the church that you need to understand. You need to start to learn the layout of the building, the apse, and the various, the rood screens and all these different elements that are architectural elements that the speaker here is struggling with. and he's looking at it and he's trying to read the building, but he doesn't quite know the language. And so he's at a little bit at a loss. And of course, one of the things he's thinking about is precisely the reality that the church is becoming less and less a real living part of people's daily lives. And so the churches are beginning to fall out of use. Once again, you may have made this observation. I've made it numerous times here near me. When you walk by churches on Sunday and the church is letting out, and you start to notice that the average age of the people leaving the building is roughly the average age of your grandparents, that it's people that are quite old. You don't see a whole lot of young people. You don't see children as a general rule. You don't see young adults with families. You see mostly old people. That's a distinct difference. When I was growing up, when I was a child, we were forced to go to church. And, we went, and it was kind of a social thing. And I'm sure that still happens in lots of places. But clearly, the prominence and the place that it plays, certainly in Quebec society, has diminished. And so he's conjuring a little bit of that. When churches fall completely out of use, what shall we turn them into? If we shall keep a few cathedrals chronically on show, their parchment plate and pyx in locked cases. Okay, the parchment plate and pyx, obviously that's alliterative, reiterating the P sound at the beginning of those, but it's also referring to many of the sacred objects. Right? A pyx is one of those containers that holds the Holy Eucharist. You have all that brass stuff up at the holy end actually has names, right? And those names are sacred objects, the tabernacle and the chalice, and all of those religious terms that if we use in a non-religious context, they become profane and profanity. But in a religious context, they have a very particular meaning and sense. And so here are all those things. They're usually very ornate, okay? Particularly in a Catholic church, you have gold, lots of gold and lots of goldsmith work that's typically highly valuable and often artistically significant. So we put them in locked cases, things to look at. But again, we have this reality of the church as a place where you go to worship versus the church as a place where you go to be a tourist. Okay, and if you go and visit Notre Dame, which you can't do now, number one, because of the COVID crisis, and number two, because of the big fire there. But if you were in a position to be able to do that, Notre Dame is a place where, you have millions of people a year going there. Many of them go for church services, but many, many more go to see the rose window and to see the various, the towers and the various architectural elements of this church that are quite beautiful. So we have these few cathedrals chronically on show to remind us of this beauty. And this is precisely the context that the poem exists in. The speaker is visiting this church, and he's kind of wondering why you go there. If you remember, again, I'm making connections back earlier in the semester for a variety of reasons when we saw John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, and we have this process of the speaker in that poem engaging in this extended dialogue with the urn, trying to understand it, trying to make sense of it. And the poem is actually the act of trying to make sense of it. In a certain way, this poem, similarly, is an act of trying to make sense of the significance of the church. Now, the church has a slightly different meaning than an urn does. The urn is an artistic object. It has a utility to it. So does the church. The church is an artistic object in the sense it's a building, an architectural object, and it also has a meaning. The difference is the meaning seems to be much more central here and also much more kind of esoteric. The speaker is trying to make sense of what it is. And so what are we going to do when they start to grow out of use, when people no longer use the church? What are we going to do with these buildings? Are we going to keep them as tourist attractions, some of them, and let the rest rent free to rain and sheep? Shall we avoid them as unlucky places? And it's kind of made a curious comment here that to let them rent free to rain and sheep. The church seems to be losing its status. If you remember earlier on, he's talked about the roof in the church having been cleaned or restored. Suddenly, leaving them rent-free to rain and sheep implies that perhaps they're not going to continue to be maintained. And certainly the maintenance of the building is ongoing, and it's a demand. It requires a certain amount of money, and so it's a burden. But he's looking to this future, almost a post-Christian future, if you will, when the church no longer plays the role that it plays. And again, this is the product of a society where the once powerful church no longer exerts that same power. And so now we're confronting a new and different reality, a reality that's in conflict with the reality that used to be. The next thing that the speaker starts to confront is some of this issue of what the church actually is. In the following stanza, the idea of superstition and belief become key issues. So the previous stanza ends, "Shall we avoid them as unlucky places? Or after dark will dubious women come to make their children touch a particular stone, pick simples for a cancer, or on some advised night see walking a dead one. Power of some sort or other will go on in games, in riddles, seemingly at random. But superstition, like belief, must die. And what remains when disbelief has gone? Grass, weedy pavement, brambles, buttress, sky." So here again, coming back to that idea of the post-Christian reality and what will happen when the church is no longer this force that it once was. And he fixes on the idea of superstition. Certainly when we consider faith, religious faith, if you were to call it superstition, that would be slightly disparaging, slightly derogatory in some people's minds. But superstition implies that it's kind of an irrational reaction to situations. Belief, however, is not necessarily rational. Faith is faith. You believe or you don't believe, but it's not based on any kind of rational, logical process. So superstition, like belief, must die, and what remains when disbelief has gone? So he's going back to this time of children coming with their mothers to touch a particular stone. You rub a particular stone for good luck. Picking simples for cancer, right? These medicinal herbs. So it's all kind of, it's putting Christianity and religion, organized religion in general, in a very primitive place, which is an attitude that some people hold. And so he's questioning the utility of what it is. And what remains when disbelief has gone, we come back to the building of the church. Grass, weedy pavement, brambles, buttress, sky. And so here the church that once was a church is now a wreckage of a church. Again, going back to Shakespeare, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang, Tintern Abbey with the destroyed monastery. And here we have grass, weedy pavement, brambles, buttress, sky. Grass obviously growing within the church, but the weedy pavement implies that the floor of the church, which is typically stone, would now be sprouting plants in between it, weeds, brambles. Brambles are plants with typically with briars. And buttress. Buttress is one of the architectural elements of the church. It's actually an element of Gothic architecture. The flying buttress is a support on the outside of a wall that enables people to build higher. So, for example, Notre Dame in Paris is the most famous of those because all around the base of the church you have these flying buttresses. And so the idea here is the buttresses are there and the sky. So the wreckage of the church, the ruin of the church is still there, but the roof is not. And so we have a church that is a building that used to be a church, but now it's no longer practical, useful as a church, but it's something else. And what he's suggesting is that the power of the building, the space around it, this sacredness, has something. There's something still there. a shape less recognizable each week, a purpose more obscure. I wonder who will be the last, the very last, to seek this place for what it was, one of the crew that tap and jot and know what rude lofts were, some ruin bibber, randy for antique, or Christmas addict, counting on a whiff of gown and bands and organ pipes and myrrh? Or will he be my representative, bored, uninformed, knowing the ghostly silt dispersed, yet tending to this cross of ground through suburb scrub because it held unspilt so long and equably what since is found only in separation, marriage and birth and death, and thoughts of these, for whom was built this special shell. For though I have no idea what this accoutred frowsty barn is worth, it pleases me to stand in silence here. Here we have an ongoing rumination about this place and it falling into disuse, the church going away, and in particular the physical building of the church going away, falling into disrepair, the roof caving in, and we have only the sky and the weedy pavement and the brambles. A shape less recognizable each week. Okay, as the building crumbles, it becomes less and less recognizable as the building it once was, and certainly the utility of it becomes less clear as well, a purpose more obscure. Okay, as you get further and further removed from it in time, it's not clear to what extent we still understand that, right? When you go and if you go and look at classical Greek ruins, for example, it's very difficult if you don't know things about the society. They're very far away from our society. So if you don't know that they were a polytheistic society with anthropomorphic gods, then you might not know what certain things mean, right? Some of the art and some of the symbolic elements are less clear because they're so far away, 2,000 years ago or more. We don't have a clear sense of it. So he's sort of imagining in the future where the church falls into disrepair and it becomes something like the Acropolis, these piles of rubble that we have to interpret. And if you don't know what they are, they become a foreign language. And so he's looking back on this, seeing the types of people who came here, who were drawn to this place, right? Who will be the last, the very last, to seek this place for what it was? And he has this almost sentimental view, the crew that tap and jot and know what rood lofts were. Rood lofts are an architectural element of the church, where the rood screen separated the choir and the body of the congregation. So it's typically an architectural element kind of up high, and it usually was a place where certain paintings and sculptures were produced. So it had a practical architectural use that also became an artistic use. But not everybody knows what a rood loft is, and so he's suggesting that these types of people who were initiated into the cult of the church, or some ruin bibber, randy for antique. Okay, randy means horny, so getting excited about these old things. Christmas addict, counting on a whiff of gown and bands and organ pipes and myrrh. Okay, almost the ritual associated, right? The robes of the priest and the organs and the myrrh, the incense that was burned. So this ritualized element of what the church was. Somebody who would still be addicted to that, a Christmas addict, okay? The ritualized elements of the Mass. Or will he be my representative? Bored, uninformed, okay? Somebody who's here, who's not part of that, who hasn't really accepted fully the church and its place. It'll be something else for him, right? And he looks at this place and what it once was, right? All these rituals, what since is found only in separation, marriage, birth, and death. And in a sense, that's often where the church has still maintained its place. even if you don't go to church, the likelihood that you go to church for a baptism of a newborn child, a marriage, or a funeral, those are places where even if we're not very fervently religious, we often still fall back on religion for those rituals and rites in our lives. And so he's suggesting that that has kind of, the church has receded from this primary place in our lives to this somewhat secondary place where, even though, and I find that always strange when I talk to Quebecers who are not necessarily religious, but they baptize their children and they get married in a church. And it has to do with, part of it is cultural perhaps, but that's exactly what he's talking about. The cultural legacy of the church is still there, even if the active, vital part of the religion seems to be perhaps fading into the past. And certainly much of that is associated, again, with the physical structure, the building itself that houses the church. For though I have no idea what this accoutred frowsty barn is worth, it pleases me to stand in silence here. An accoutred frowsty barn is kind of an unusual way to refer to the building. He's referring to the church. This accoutred frowsty barn. Accoutred has its origins in French, right? Accoutrements are kind of embellishments, things that make something beautiful, extra stuff. It's kind of a strange usage in English, but it exists. Frowsty is sort of a little bit self-important, and obviously barn is another curious term because the church is seen as a sacred building, and so the idea that you would classify it as a barn, which would be obviously a non-sacred building. A barn is a building where you house animals, and it would be the epitome of non-sacredness. That's somewhat disparaging. So calling the building an accoutred frowsty barn is calling into question its usefulness. Certainly during the French Revolution, famously, Napoleon, who was quite anti-clerical in the aftermath of the revolution, he utilized some of the famous churches in France, most particular, I believe, Saint-Étienne in Paris, which is a gorgeous church, probably the second most beautiful church in Paris after Notre Dame, and he used it as a place to stable animals. So you had horses and cows and things in the church. That's kind of a sign of disrespect for what you think the institution is. So treating the church building like a barn is precisely diminishing its symbolic importance. So the speaker here is asking about its worth. For though I have no idea what this accoutred frowsty barn is worth, it pleases me to stand in silence here. And here he comes to his takeaway, the ending, the final stanza of the poem, which suggests that, again, this speaker, who throughout has been skeptical of religion's role, still acknowledges something of its power. He can't quite qualify what it is. He can't say exactly what it is that makes religion a powerful force, but he can say that it is. It pleases me to stand in silence here, a serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies, and that much never can be obsolete, since someone will forever be surprising a hunger in himself to be more serious and gravitating with it to this ground, which he once heard was proper to grow wise in, if only that so many dead lie round. It's a fascinating ending to the poem because throughout the poem, it's clearly been very disparaging about religion, yet in the end, it's suggesting that there's some germ of what religious sentiment is that remains important. And he's not going to say that it's the church, but that the church becomes this symbol of it, it's this place, right? And I believe we've talked about this earlier in the semester, the idea of syncretism, where very often a sacred place will house sacredness and power. You see it a lot. If you visit in Rome, there's a beautiful church, San Clemente in Rome, near the Coliseum. And San Clemente is Catholic basilica that's built on top of previous pre-Christian pagan temples. And so you can go down into the basement, and you go down into the basement of San Clemente, and further down it's been excavated, and you can go down to the very, very deep base and find a Mithraic shrine, which was prayed to the god Mithra. And then you can find other earlier pre-Christian ones, and then eventually you get to the Catholic Church on top. They kept building on top of the sacred space that was there before. Similarly, the Catholic Church in Peru, in Cusco, is built on the top of an Inca shrine. So you have the Inca stonework on the base, and then you have the Catholic basilica built on top of it. It's like you appropriate the sacredness of the place. And so here he's suggesting that the space, the actual physical space that the church occupies, has something, and it draws people to it. And he can't quite qualify what that is. A serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destiny, and that much never can be obsolete. There's still like this perpetual human quest to understand our place, and whether or not you agree with what the church is, the church has served that purpose, and if you take that away, something else has to take its place. We can't just exist in a vacuum, according to the poem. So that much can never be obsolete, since someone will forever be surprising a hunger in himself to be more serious, and gravitating with it to this ground, which he once heard was proper to grow wise in, if only that so many dead lie round. And of course the last line alludes to the fact that a typical country churchyard would have the graveyard associated with it. And so the graveyard also maintains this sacredness, a sacred reverence for the ancestors that are buried there, and a sacred sense of, again, whether the Christian idea of life after death continues. And so the poem ends on that note. As I mentioned, it's not necessarily a religious poem, but it's a poem that questions some of the sentiments behind religion. And in fact, in an interview, Larkin once said, I was a bit irritated by an American who insisted to me that it's a religious poem. It's not religious. Religion surely means that the affairs of this world are under divine surveillance and so on. And I go to some pains to point out that I don't bother with that sort of thing, that I'm deliberately ignorant of it, up at the Holy End, for instance. Okay, and so he mentions that the poem itself is slightly anti-religious, but it's getting at a sentiment that is certainly conjured there, the idea of religion. I'm going to move now to the next poem, which we will not speak very long about, but I will address it just because I find it to be an interesting poem. The poem is entitled, "This Be the Verse." It's short but sweet. It's quite irreverent. The first line is quite famous. I'll read the poem quickly and talk about it briefly. They fuck you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats, who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands misery on to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can, and don't have any kids yourself. It might be a curious poem for us to end the semester with, but that's the way we're going to roll with it. So Larkin is expressing a sentiment here that's kind of, it's a curious one, okay? They fuck you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. Now what he's suggesting is that parents, everybody pretty much, unless you're a sociopath, anybody who has children tries their best to be a good parent. But sometimes we can't help but repeat the things that were done to us. And so generally, the same mistakes that your parents made in raising you, you will likely make raising your children. And certainly we can, we're free to believe that we won't make mistakes, but the fact of the matter is most of us do. Your parents, I'm sure, love you immensely, and they do the best they can, but some of the things they do are not necessarily in your best interest. They just do it because that's the way they imagine the act of being a parent. And so here he's suggesting that in spite of all the best intentions that parents have, they often make mistakes. And some of those mistakes are the result of mistakes that were made with them. And it's very hard to change. This is a somewhat cynical perspective expressed in this poem, but it's kind of on target in a lot of ways, that we try the best we can, but we perpetuate what happened to us. We're kind of the victims, if you will, that's not too strong a word necessarily, of the way our parents raised us, and we make our children the victims of how we raise them. And it's not to say that everybody is horrible, but it's just to say that we, however much we try to be the best we can, we often don't succeed. And of course, the poem looks back to the previous generation. So we, the current generation, has been perhaps badly treated, or at least mistakes have been made in raising by our parents, and then our parents' parents were also responsible for doing the same thing to them. And we kind of have this image of old-fashioned, strict, stern ideas, but they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats, who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. It's like this trying to find the right way. Soppy stern. Soppy is too soft, too emotional. Stern is hard. So it's like trying to find this middle balance and not being able to succeed. And then the last stanza is quite pessimistic, I would say. Man hands misery onto man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. So it's like pain and suffering is part of human existence. We give it to others. It deepens like a coastal shelf. A coastal shelf is the side of the coastline where suddenly you have this very rapid descent moving away from land into the ocean. And so this process is kind of geologic, almost biological, much bigger than us. And so it's not possible to transcend it. Now, of course, Larkin is not advocating, I think he's advocating in the face of society where this buoyant, optimistic post-war society, the husband, the wife, the two kids, and all this prosperity of post-war society, he doesn't see that as perhaps such a good thing. And the last lines of the poem, get out as early as you can, one could argue for that almost as if that you shouldn't continue living, or certainly you shouldn't, there's a call to possible suicide there, but that you wouldn't want to reproduce, certainly you wouldn't want to replicate your experiences, which is obviously our biological imperative. We are, programmed almost to want to reproduce and create children before we leave. But here he's advocating for the opposite. Get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. So abdicating that idea of the family and the possibilities that represents. So as I said, we won't go too deep into this poem. I think it's a playful poem, but it's also slightly pessimistic. It's an interesting one. I often invoke it in studies of family dynamics when we look at family obligations and things like that, and how we, at a psychological level, there's a lot that could be said. Certainly a psychological reading of this poem could give some very interesting insights. So, we have now, our revels now have ended, as Shakespeare says at the end of The Tempest. The semester is pretty much over. In the coming class periods, I will post for you all a series of questions that will be the basis of the final written assignment that we will have for the class. I will post a number of questions for you to prepare for. In the coming class periods, we'll have a review period where you can communicate with me. I will have a Zoom video conference where we can communicate if you have questions. And then in our last class period, I will give you the question that you are to write on, and you will write on it during our class period. So you will have a typical 2-hour class period, much like we did in the beginning of the semester. when we had writing assignments, in-class writing assignments. This would be the equivalent of that. However, it will not be an in-class writing assignment, which obviously means you can use other resources. Typically, I let you use your notes and things like that. If you were to use secondary sources outside of our notes and things like that, you would be expected to reference them properly. Any negligence in that respect would possibly have dire consequences. So make sure that if you're using source material, I would highly recommend that you don't go to Schmoop and SparkNotes and Wikipedia, etc. as your sources. But if you're using any sources at all, you should definitely be clear and transparent in their use. So you should quote them verbatim and let me know which words are yours and which words are not yours, because otherwise that would be problematic. So, as I said, we will have the opportunity to communicate via Zoom conference. So any questions you have, you can convey at that point. Certainly, you are free to convey any questions you have to me directly via Mio, if you have any. And the grade scheme will be updated in the coming days. I am collating the various assignments that we've done recently in our new model, our distance learning model. And so I will make as clear as I can on Omnivox the grading paradigm. So you will have those assignments. I will typically drop the lowest assignment on among the written assignments in class, not the large texts, but the reading quizzes and the quizzes you've been doing in response to our work over the last few weeks. So those will create an average, and among those I will throw out the lowest grade. So if you have one bad grade, that one will disappear. So presumably your average should go up. But again, if you have any questions about that, the Zoom period would be perfectly fine for addressing that. And if you have a more specific question, you can ask me via Mio. So on that note, I will bid you goodbye, and I will look forward to speaking to you in the coming class periods. Have a nice day.